However, this segment's just to address the general liability issues facing you as practitioners. So my first question for you, Damian, is why should a list agent use an electronic lockbox?
Well, obviously they provide security to your seller. There's a lot of advantages to having electronic lockboxes. I mean, Denver is still on the old mechanical lockboxes, but I think they're the last major metropolitan area in the country that hasn't changed over to the electronic lockboxes. So there's several reasons to use them for a listing broker, but the biggest one is protecting the house, making sure that the house is secure, making sure you know who's accessing the property, and giving that seller a comfort level that there aren't people going in there that shouldn't be there.
What do you want to say to our members about the risk consideration for the list brokers should you choose to or not to use an electronic box?
Well, when you're talking about listing brokers, there's a couple different areas of risk. So the first one is you have this day code system that you have listing brokers that allow people to get a day code. And the problem with the day code, unlike the Century Lock app, as we've discussed in the last two videos, is that it gives them a right to give it to whomever they like. So I think listing brokers have an obligation to talk to their sellers about day codes. And it's not that I'm opposed to people giving out day codes, but they at least got to talk about what those risks could be with the day codes. And the fact that they've been abused in certain instances where people have given them out to people that were not licensed and didn't have a right to access the property. And so if nothing else, brokers should be having a conversation with their sellers saying that, you know, there's a practice to give out day codes. This makes things easier for a buyer. It gives people that may not be part of our system access to your property to make sure that we have access to a lot more other buyers. At the same time, it's less secure. It can be abused. There can be people accessing your property that are not licensed realtors. And let the seller determine whether or not they want to do that. I will tell you from my viewpoint, if I'm a seller, I'm not going to grant day code access. I'm going to say this is my home, this is my sanctuary, this is where my kids live. I'm not going to take a chance that somebody's going to access this that doesn't have background checks, E&O insurance, and a license. The other thing is the other issue is this, is that a lot of times a buyer broker call up a listing broker and say, hey Patrick, I'm going to go down and I'm going to give access to my inspector to do the inspection and I'm not going to be there. And a listing broker knows that they're giving a day code access to somebody and the broker is not going to be there, then they're really taking on some liability. The minute that you know that somebody isn't licensed, you better have permission of your seller to have somebody in there that is not a broker, and know that you're probably exposing your seller's exposing themselves to the fact that if they get hurt on the property or anything along those lines, then it's going to be their coverage, it's going to be their liability, and that there could be some issues that come out of this. I think a listing broker that does not do that that knowingly gives out day codes knowing that the buyer broker is not going to be there is taking on that liability. The last thing I'd like to say about the listing broker is that if you are going to give out day codes, and again, it's not that day codes are necessarily inherently bad, it's just they are inherently risky. If you're going to give out a day code, at least confirm in an email. Send something to the broker, the buyer broker, that says, hey, we've given you access by a day code. Please understand that you must be there at all times. It's just a lot of times these things are being abused, and what they're doing is buyer broker doesn't have the time to go down there. You know, you told me a story at the break about people just, it used to be commonplace that everybody knew the broker was going to be on site, and that's just not the case now. I mean, isn't that what you said with the...
Yeah, I see often in the show agent remarks, broker must be present, which, of course, as many of you know, we assumed the broker was going to be present, so the fact that brokers are now putting that in there, we're seeing issues that this is a concern.
Yeah, and it makes sense. The market's heated up. People are getting busy. They can't always be there for one buyer, so sometimes people take shortcuts and they send their inspector over with a day code, or they send their buyer over with a day code, or send their contractor over with a day code. If you're a listing broker, I'd send an email saying, we've given you access by a day code, please understand that you still must be there. The other thing is if they're a Century Lock person and they're asking for a day code, I think I'd ask them why. You know, what is the purpose of having a day code if you have the app on your phone?
Right.
You know it's going to be misused. And to me, that cuts against you if you still kind of give the day code and ignore the signs that they're not going to be there.
Right. So the big takeaways on the list side, you would say, is first, have a clear discussion with your seller on day code use.
Yeah, and the risks, absolutely.
And then follow that up with having that in the listing agreement so we don't end up with amnesia should something go bad.
Absolutely.
Okay, second thing would be making sure that the broker is going to be there.
Yes.
And then the third thing would be anytime you give a day code, follow that up with some sort of form of communication to re-illustrate the fact that they're going to be there. Hey, Damian, I'm giving you a day code. Really appreciate you showing my property on 123 Main Street. By the way, I want to confirm that you will be on site with this day code when you show the property or you meet the contractor at the house.
At all times, too. I mean, the other thing I'd add in that email is that this is at all times that somebody's there and secure the property on your way out. I mean, that's what you're expecting from them. And you know as well as I do, sometimes people just go in and say, okay, I'll see you later. We'll be back in an hour. That doesn't work.
We appreciate that insight on that. As far as the buyer's agent side goes,
yes.
What would be a synopsis of what we're trying to get across to the buyer's agents who are now either asking for, receiving, or giving day codes to their possible buyers and inspectors? So go over some of those.
You know, this issue, they have a lot of liability. Buyer brokers, you have a lot of liability if you're improperly using your access or your ability to gain access to a property. I mean, if you are abusing that, there is a lot of concerns for you. Number one, E&O insurance. And we talked about this in the other two videos, but I think it bears repeating, is that your E&O insurance provides coverage for lockbox. It's $75,000 if you're on the RICE policy or the state policy. It could go up based on other policies that you have. But that is important coverage that covers back in bodily injury and property damage coverage for you. And if you're not going to the property and you're not the one accessing the property with the lockbox, you may or may not have coverage. And that's irrelevant of the other issues that we have. Another issue might be a procuring cause issue. So we talked about this in the buyer broker video, but sometimes we have brokers that are just too busy, and that's my favorite. Oh, I'm too busy to do my job. And I was like, great, okay, so then why are you in this business? But if you're too busy to do your job and you send the buyer down to look at the house themselves, and then you send the inspector to go do the inspection themselves, and you do all this stuff that you never even go to the property, and the only thing you ever did was write a contract and buyer listing contract, are you really the procuring cause? Or was the listing broker who ended up showing your buyer the property 3 times before they ended up writing the contract and who did the negotiations there, are they the procuring cause? I think buyer brokers have a risk of not even getting paid if they're not doing their job of showing up on the property and showing the buyers the area. Another issue, and there's 2 of them with the real estate commission. One of them is competency. So if you don't have access to the property, chances are that means that you're not a broker that is in that geographical area. That tends to be the issue. I know that we talked about in Colorado Springs there are some brokers that don't want to pay the $9 to get access to all the properties by Century Lock. So that's a little different. They probably have the geographical experience in the area. But if you're coming in from another area into other areas, like you're going into Denver, you're going into Pueblo, you have to have competency. And a lot of times, people that don't have access to property means that they don't have access to the MLS information or what's going on in the neighborhoods, or whether it's in
school districts, septic, water issues. Go down the list. Right?
Oh, it's insane.
It's insane.
And that creates a competency issue. And if you don't have competency, then the real estate commission's going to take it up with you. They're gonna find license law violations. The other issue along those access things are that it could be a violation of license law for your duties to your buyer. I mean, here your buyer has expectations that you're going to be able to get them into these properties to show them the properties. And if you're not signed up for Century Lock, then you better find another vehicle for getting access to the property. And as we talked in some of the other videos, the access, it's not that you have to sign up for Century Lock. So don't take this as me being a commercial for Century Lock that you have to sign up. I think it's possibly the easiest way to solve your problem is to pay the $9. But the other access is you could call the listing broker and say, hey, can you give me access to the property? Can we make arrangements to go see the property? Don't assume that you're entitled to a day code, because you're not. You could also make arrangements that the seller will be there, or co-list with somebody else. And that goes to the competency issue too, is that if you're a buyer broker and you're in an area that is not your expertise, which is, I think, primarily where we have these access issues, is that somebody has strayed out of their geographical area and they've gone to somewhere else. You know, why deal with all these issues? Why not co-list it with somebody else and say, hey, I got a buyer that's looking in the area. They're very good friends of mine. I still want to represent them, Patrick, but I don't have access. I'd really like to lean on your expertise. Let's co-list them. We'll split up the commission, whatever seems fair to both of us based on the work that we're doing, because I'm still doing work. But let's co-list them and let's make sure that we provide the best services for that buyer. And I think that's a good solution a lot of times when you don't have access, when it's due to the fact that you're in a different area trying to sell in an area you're not used to. Lastly, buyer brokers, you have to assume that you are supposed to be on site. I know that, like you just talked about in this video, that you're seeing more and more in the showing instructions that they're instructing buyer brokers you must be there. Well, that's the case. I mean, you have to assume that you are supposed to be there unless the listing broker for some reason gives you the right not to be there. And like I said, it seems like in most cases there's really no reason for them to give you that right.
Well, and a couple things to touch on as you brought these up. If you're a buyer's agent sending your buyer down the road, right, the last thing you want is for them to talk to the list agent. I mean, we know that buyers cannot keep their mouth shut on the disclosure of, I've got to move here, my mom lives down the street.
I can afford $350,000 home.
But this is $280 and I'm going to lowball it. I mean, it's just become such an issue if you're going to do it that way. So I would definitely, like you said, co-op with another agent that's not the list agent.
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't even like when my buyers accidentally walk into a open house necessarily where the realtor's there, and I'm like, what did you tell them, right? So that's of course one issue. And then touching on you must be on site, I think that used to be a given. And I think you illustrate the point well that unless you get permission not to be on site, which I still think you should be, that's another issue that has come up so often frequently with agents is we're sending our buyers right down the street with nobody on site
or talk to the seller and blow up the deal.
Or a contractor's going into a house that now you've granted access to and you're not there to make sure it's all good. Right? That something didn't go missing during that time period and we don't know better because you weren't there.
Exactly. Absolutely. I agree entirely.
And then on the procuring cause, which you touched on also, I think that that's a great subject to let people know that you can't even really be a buyer's agent if you never saw the house. That would be really hard to pull off in the eyes of the commission, right? I had advocacy and never entered the property.
Yeah, how do you say that you have properly advised your client if you didn't go look at the property and you have any idea what it even looks like, what it's even worth? How do you compare it to sold comps if you've never been in it?
I often tell brokers, because this is like something close to my heart, is I would never go to Florida and think I could sell myself a house.
Right.
I would never do that. I would go to Florida and find a broker who knows the areas, and yet just because it's in the boundaries of Colorado and we have the legality side of stating we can sell wherever we want, we should be very cautious when doing that, because a lot of times we don't know where we're selling, even though it's in the state. I can tell you there's areas of the state I have never been to that I don't know anything about, that I would never represent myself in personally.
Well, and you make a very, very good point, and I guess that goes back to the co-listing, is you go to different areas in the state and there is different problems. Superfund sites, mistletoe, beetle kill, limited improvement districts.
Water is always an issue in the state of Colorado.
Absolutely, and you don't know what you don't know about those areas. And
in the different areas on health, you've got the health departments with different septic rules that a lot of people don't know about.
Permits.
Yeah, so a lot of reasons to know where you sell, and professionals refer.
Yeah, and like I said, even if it's your best friend, it's your brother, whoever it is, that I'm not saying you have to give up representing them. I mean, referring is, sometimes referring just makes more sense. But this is somebody that's really close. They bought a whole bunch of properties from you, and you really feel like I got to be involved, because otherwise, if they feel like I'm not involved, they'll feel like I'm abandoning them. I mean, I get that. I do.
Sure.
Great. Co-list with somebody else and say, you know what, I'm tapping somebody else to bring into this transaction to better represent you. Do you really think your buyer's going to have a problem with that?
No, they shouldn't, because we've got a very near and dear story of a property management property we now manage where the out-of-area broker overstated the rent dramatically. They didn't know. They just didn't know, and it was a relation, a brother-sister relation. Yeah. And so now you've got a property that the poor brothers in this situation with a rent that was quoted wrong because they just didn't know the rent.
Absolutely.
So then reach out to a professional in the area at the very minimum and have that recommendation from them that here's the professional side of the house. They know the area. I'll help you on the rest.
Absolutely. Okay. I think it just makes sense.
Is there anything that we need to touch on that you think is important for the realtors to know about regarding this topic that we've missed?
You know, I think we've touched on everything, but I want to drive something home. And what I want to drive home is that this is not an inspector issue. This is not about granting issue to a buyer. This is about granting access to somebody's home that is unlicensed. And it doesn't matter what form of unlicensed that looks like. If the person is unlicensed, that means they're unlicensed. That means it's a liability. That means it's a problem. And so for the buyer brokers out there, understand that there really is rare circumstances where you should be granting access to anybody other than yourself. Even when the listing broker gives you the right to have access to the property, you might have liability by virtue of your E&O insurance not covering. You know, it all depends on what that policy says. And for listing brokers, you know, you don't want to grant access to somebody that doesn't have a license. And it's because any unlicensed person going in there could be a liability, could be a pedophile, could be a murder, could be somebody without insurance, could be whatever kind of liability that now is imposed upon your seller, and obviously you're going to be the target. So that's what it really boils down to me, is granting access to people that don't have licenses. And it doesn't matter what shape or form that is in, contractors, unlicensed assistants, buyers, inspectors, people picking up radon tests, whatever it is, that's where the problem is.
The biggest takeaway after having these discussions with you for me is none of these examples you gave were an issue until they became an issue, and then they were a big issue, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you may get away with this without any issues
Absolutely.
forever, but when it
Absolutely.
becomes one, then you end up accidentally in the packet for the 4-hour mandatory class sometimes, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, when it's an issue, now you're into a whole lot of liability realms of, is there coverage for me, or am I paying for the attorney out of my pocket? Is there a license law violation that I might have discipline against my license? Is my buyer or seller going to turn on me and start suing me? I mean, those are real liability issues, and you know, and that becomes a big problem.
Damian, we really appreciate your time. And PPAR and realtors watching this, we appreciate you watching this. We hope it was educational, and we hope to be back soon with more information with Damian.
All right,
Damian,
thank you.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.